This is kind of an introduction to John 3, and we're going to talk about a rhetorical device that John uses, and then a little bit of an introduction to Nicodemus, and then next week we'll go more into the dialogue of Nicodemus, and this will be a good introduction. What I want to do today, before we get into a rhetorical device that John puts in his gospel writing that's going to help illustrate or elevate his argument, his what he's trying to communicate. Before we get there, I want to briefly cover theories of inspiration. And this gets really confusing because it's never taught, like ever. You have to go seek out the information. So number one on your handout, well, I'll show you what I'm going to use. This is a different handout than what you have, but I'm going to cover the same information. So I'm going to just show you this graphic right here in a minute. This is not what yours looks like, but I will be using the same information. And I have another handout on the website that looks like this, because I did a short video on it a few weeks ago. But the theories of inspiration, let me back up. Theories of inspiration is, how did we get these words in the Bible? So we say that these are the words of God. And the word we use is inspired. But then you have to ask, well, what does that mean? What do we mean by that? And somehow this revelation of God comes down and enters into a human being, which then writes it down. And it's a bit of a mystery. I mean, I think I even have on this other handout, it's the mystery of inspiration. And we kind of have to hold it as a mystery, that we're not exactly sure how this happens. It doesn't happen the same for all people. And so before we get into John using literary devices, I just want to walk through this idea of inspiration. So on the footnote on your handout, I mentioned the book that I got it from. This was the theology book that I used in seminary. And part of the reason that our professor chose this one is Millard Erickson he's a conservative evangelical, but when he writes about every doctrine, what he tries to do is lay out the landscape of the entire doctrine itself. Here's how it has changed over time. Here's the history. Here's who originally came up with the doctrine. Here's what it means. And what he doesn't do is say, here's what you ought to believe. So there are other systematic theology books that will only present the argument that the author wants you to hear. So Millard Erickson, when you get to the chapter on inspiration, is then going to lay out all of these theories of inspiration that we have. And then it kind of helps you place yourself in that, where am I on that spectrum of the theory? And then what are the arguments either for or against? So what we find is that there's a gigantic chasm between biblical scholars on one side and the church and your everyday Christian on the other. And what I'm trying to do, at least with this ministry, is in some part bridge this gap, right? We want to bring some of this scholarly work over here. Because, for instance, in John, you can see John is using literary devices. But if you go to a regular old church person and say, look at the literary devices that John's using, they'll look at you like, what are you talking about? I don't see any of that, because they're not close enough to the text itself. And then they may have a conception of how that Bible got there, which doesn't include literary devices. This gets really confusing for people, but this is what we're trying to do. biblical scholars who spend a lot of time with John see all these patterns that most people in the church will never see. And that's why any study of the Bible, like in John, we're very intentional about looking at everything that John's doing. You'll see things that you never saw before. So this is what we're trying to do. Now, this is what your handout looks today. So here's our chapter 3 introduction. We're starting out with these theories of inspiration. And the question that I'm asking is, how involved is John in crafting this gospel letter? And so when I show you the spectrum of theories, the one that the church people in church generally assume is something akin to dictation. Like you sit down and God dictates, and there's no involvement in the writer. But we can see by studying John that John's involved with the writing. He's using culture and techniques that his audience would know. Even Paul, one of the most enlightening things you can do to study Paul is go visit the regions and study the regions that Paul wrote to, because he speaks completely different to the Galatians than he does to the Colossians or to the Ephesians, even though they're all in the same country. And that would be akin to if someone said all Americans think alike. Well, if you're in America, you go, oh, no, they don't. Go to New York City. They don't think like the people in Mississippi. It's like the cultures are so dominant. So Paul writes to the cultures and includes things that the culture gets. All right, so let's go. So I want to start then. What Millard Erickson is saying is this is how scholars view it. So if you just look at scholarly work on inspiration, and I'm going to start over on this side because there are scholars who would say, and the other thing is we have to be very gracious. These are scholars who are Christians. It just means they have a different view of how the Bible got here. Because the more you get, the more rigid over here you get, the more you'll look down on the people over here. Because, hey, you don't believe the same way I do, you must be wrong. And that becomes, obviously, that's not good. We have to be humble about this whole process. So they would say over here, and now he just labels it intuition, which, intuition in the first century is God. There's no difference. If they have an intuition, to them, it's God, because everything comes from God. But intuition just means, hey, they have insight to humanity. So, you might have somebody, a Greek philosopher, and the Greek philosopher says, don't lie. And we would say, that's not inspired. You're like, well, wait a minute. He recognizes that lying is bad. There's something about the cosmos that says lying is bad. That's just intuitive. And then he says, don't lie. You'll have a better life if you don't lie. But because it's not written in the Bible, don't lie, as if it's coming from God, we have a hard time accepting it from somebody else. But intuition. So lots of people have intuitions about the world, the nature of reality, and God can reveal himself even to Gentiles. That's part of the message. So perhaps that intuition is correct. Illumination. God is involved in some way, shape, or form, but maybe the percentage goes from 0 to 25. I'm just making that up. I don't know. But somewhere God can illuminate the mind, but he doesn't directly step in with write this particular word. This one, and by the way, I put this on the handout, this is where the majority of scholars fall. And this to me makes the most sense, is they just call it dynamic. And that, of course, doesn't really give you anything solid to hang on to because it's dynamic. It allows God to provide an inspired message. So the message comes from God, but the writer retains personality. He can write to his own culture. He can use his own method of communicating this message. So the writer remains in some way independent himself in his ability to communicate, right? So, hey, I got a message from God. Well, how did that message show up? Was it a vision? Well, if it's a vision like in Daniel or a vision like in Ezekiel, I've got to figure out how to put that vision into words. God didn't dictate a sentence to me. Maybe he gave me an intuition, which God does sometimes, or he gives you a symbol. And the symbol means something, and now I've got to communicate that, but God allows me to interpret that. So that's dynamic. Now you start getting, this side starts to get more and more rigid, where verbal says, God is even choosing words. So directing the author to use particular words. Now, how would we ever know that? I'm not sure, but verbal, and then over here, dictation. And this is where many people, particularly I know in America, we are, fundamentalism within Christianity was spawned out of America. So many people in the church have a very rigid dictation like, where, and let me show you, this is what I envision dictation to look like. So when I first went to church and I would hear, it was an evangelical church, and the pastor would say, this book is inspired by God. These are the inspired words of God. These are the authoritative inspired words of God, right? So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I would think to myself, what does that mean? Like, how did that happen? And so what I pictured was always an old man sitting by candlelight and getting like a download of words to write down. Almost like, Edgar Cayce would go into a trance and somebody would scribble down the notes as Edgar Cayce recited something. Now, maybe that happened, but now that I've been able to learn much more, it's highly unlikely that it happened this way. But this is my vision, because no one ever told me, no one ever said there are different ways to think about how the Bible is inspired. So if you go back to this dictation over here, it's almost like the writer is, a divine typewriter. Now, I think you can see this is a wide spectrum. But again, this is kind of where the majority of scholars, and the reason that the majority of scholars is because they're spending so much time with the Bible and with these individual writers, that you begin to see patterns, rhetorical devices. You see their personality come through. And when you get to, unfortunately, in church, most people don't spend that much time with the Bible, and they're never trained to think about all of these things that are going into it. And so the tendency is dictation. Now, if you have any thoughts, just interrupt me, but let me show you something even from within Judaism. At the center of inspired text of Judaism is the Torah. And this actually holds priority. Now, why does it hold priority? So in this case, Torah is more of direct from God to Moses. And there's tremendous mystery. And one thing that I fully hold to the fact that the Bible is inspired, but part of it is because the deep mystery is like a giant well of life that comes out of it. It's a never-ending well of wisdom. You can't get to the bottom of it. Well, where did that come from? A human being? It has to be an interaction between a human and divine. So there is inspiration to it. And perhaps God is going down to the level of each word. because in Hebrew, now you get really dynamic words and even the letters, even the spaces between the letters. So it gets pretty weird. But in the biblical time, in Jesus' day, Torah was primary. Then if you go to the next level, you would have the writings. And, sometimes you read a book like Kings and you think, what does that have to do with anything? What is this chapter telling me? Like, is there even a message in it? It's recounting the history of, it becomes their sacred history. So to them, it becomes a sacred writing, but not because it was God speaking directly to them. And then you have, and I'm not saying the prophets and the writings are on a different level, but you also have the prophets. Now, who in Jesus' day did not think that the writings and the prophets were inspired? Yes. So the Sadducees, they said, no, only Torah. So the Sadducees said there's no resurrection because it wasn't given as a divine revelation to Moses. But the Pharisees, they relied on both the writings and the prophets. And even, if you think about the Psalms, the Torah is God to Moses. But when you read the Psalms, it's man speaking to God. It's the opposite. Yet, by the time you get to the first century, many of those Psalms were seen as holding some kind of divine revelation. That even the person writing the Psalm had a sense of the divine that we can pull from. So it gets really crazy. That's part of the point. So, okay, or I just wanted to show you that you have a wide variation from 0% God all the way over to it's 100% God. And there's actually, you can't objectively find the answer. So you have to kind of be humble and open to the fact that as you look at something with dynamic, and then John steps in, and John has all kinds of stuff that he speaks to culture. He uses, as we'll see, these rhetorical devices. And this gets very uncomfortable when you think, so does that mean John's inspired? Well, sure, he's got an inspired message that Jesus is the Christ, but he's going to tell you about it in a way that is communicated in his own style. So you can read about those on your handout, but this is where we're at with John. And that's why we can go into John and scholars will immediately recognize the conversations, the rhetorical devices, because they're used in the ancient world, and John's audience would know that. So on your handout, I put at the bottom of page 1 that this is simply the dynamic. How did this get from God down to human beings? This is all we're trying to solve. But then you have a whole bunch of secondary issues. So the first one is translation. So the moment you have the original writing in Hebrew and you want to take that to English, you've lost something. That's just a fact, because you can't express in English what is being expressed in Hebrew in all cases. And in some, less so, but the Greek as well. When we're reading in English, we're relying on somebody's translation of a verse, which they don't always match. People don't always agree. And we even have, I know here in the United States, there are many communities who only read the King James Version, the KJV. And some communities are so committed to the King James Version that they'll even say this was inspired, that the translation itself, when it came into English, was an inspired work. Now, clearly we don't all agree with that, but you can see where it's going with this because, hey, we've got this in English. Now what do we say? Oh, well, that must be inspired too. So you start to get these secondary issues. The other secondary issue is how do you interpret it? So we have to find meaning. And of course, every church organization says, well, we're guided by the Holy Spirit. So the Catholic Church, when the Protestants broke away, said, what do you mean we're wrong? We're guided by the Holy Spirit. How would the Holy Spirit let us be wrong this long? And Protestants said, well, we're protesting anyways, and we're leaving you guys. But now you can have the same thing with Protestants. As Protestants divide, each one is claiming that the Holy Spirit is revealing something to them different than the next guy. So we have to have interpretation as well, and that becomes problematic. And and I should say this too. On some level, God doesn't care. He can use the Bible in any way he wants to bring people. People have no clue about any of these scholarly arguments, and yet see God in the Bible. You know, the first time I read John, I was blown away. It just knocked me off my feet. But I had no clue of any of this stuff. So God can use the Bible in many ways that are beyond our understanding, and even beyond whatever we hold to as far as inspiration. So, okay. Now, that said, go to page 2, and now we're going to look at a rhetorical device that's in the Gospel of John.